So I want to begin, Ami, because your piece is titled "Judaism and Zionism are Inseparable." Now, if you had gone back 80 years in time, 90 years in time, you would find a lot of Jews who would vehemently contest that proposition. And then if you come to the present, you find an increasing number of Jews who contest the proposition. But for at least 2 or 3 generations, from the late 1940s all the way up until really about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the idea that Judaism and Zionism were separable would be considered outlandish, in fact, outrageous. And something has changed. And I think it has changed very noticeably, particularly maybe in the last year following the May 2021 war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, where you had public letters from Jewish rabbinical students denouncing not just Israeli policy, but denouncing Israel itself. And I'd like you to maybe just give us a lay of the land. How did this happen? And how is it that the Jewish community has adopted positions that are not just on the Zionist left, but have kind of tilted over into anti-Zionism? What happened and what went wrong?
Well, I think primarily I don't. By the way, the title was not written by me; it was actually assigned by you. But I'm happy with the title. That Zionism and Judaism and Zionism are inseparable. I think what I know what's going on in our movement, in the Reform movement, which is the liberal side of the equation, is that we have always had, from the very beginning of Zionist theory and from the rise of the Zionist movement, we've always had this tension in the movement between our universal aspirations and the particularistic personality and character and reality of Judaism. These were always inherent in Jewish tradition from the very first, literally from the very first chapter of the first Jew in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham. And as the Reform movement developed in response to the conditions of the Enlightenment, we increasingly grew reliant on the age of reason to solve the Jewish problem and gravitated increasingly towards Enlightenment principles, not to enhance Judaism, but at the expense of Judaism. And so what developed in the Reform movement by the late 19th century, before Herzl wrote The Jewish State, before 1896 or 1897, was a pre-existing philosophy in the Reform movement that Jews are no longer a people. It was the first. This is
the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885.
Pittsburgh Platform that was itself the certain culmination of a trend that was happening for probably several decades at least. And so by the time the Zionist movement declared itself at the very end of the 19th century, the Reform movement itself was already antagonistic to this concept of Jewish peoplehood and to the centrality of Jewish peoplehood, which is, albeit from a secular perspective, at the heart of the Zionist theory, that the Jews are a people. That was the realization that Herzl, almost when you read him, it's almost like he surprised himself that he comes to the conclusion that the Jews are a people. I think part of that, by the way, was because Herzl had completely bought into the promise of the Enlightenment to solve the Jewish problem. So from that perspective, Zionism was both an unbelievably optimistic theory that, in 50 years, if you want a state, you can take a landless, languageless people and reconstitute them in the in the land of Israel. There was some discussion early on about where that would be, but essentially in the land of Israel. But at the same time, Herzl's view was harshly pessimistic because it required him to abandon the idea that Jews could integrate into Western life and be accepted, not persecuted, and be equal, which was the promise of the Enlightenment. So the Reform movement had bought into the promise of the Enlightenment, and by the time
the promise of the Enlightenment being captured by that famous phrase, for the Jews as individuals, everything, and for the Jews as a people, nothing, the kind of French revolutionary phrase.
Right. But what it essentially did is it said, look, we live in the age of reason, we live in the age of science, we live in the age of evidence. Anti-Semitism is unreasonable and irrational. All that we want is for the Jews to be loyal citizens, and then we will extend full citizenship rights and full democracy, and over time, anti-Semitism rooted in unreason will dissipate and disappear. And Herzl comes to the realization that that's not even a pipe dream. That's not even something down the road, that there's something inherently corruptive about European life that would make it impossible for the Jews, for the promise of the Enlightenment to apply to the Jews. And so that's the fundamental impetus of the Zionist movement. But the Reform movement by them, and this is symptomatic. It's characteristic of liberals that we want to put our faith in universal principles and in the promise that if you can sit down with people, reason with them, that eventually you can reason them out of an unreasonable position. And so that's why the Reform movement, when the Zionist movement came on the scene, that's why it was, and one of the reasons, one key philosophical reason why it was anti-Zionist. And so there was always this inherent tension in Judaism between what we call now universalism and particularism. But that tension is felt most significantly in the liberal side of the American Jewish community, because we are the most willing to embrace the benefits of not only the Enlightenment, but of universal values and universal.
And does that tension, is that tension a consequence of some kind of failure to understand the nature of the Enlightenment or the limits of the Enlightenment, or is it a failure to understand the nature of Judaism and Jewishness and Jewish peoplehood?
I think it's probably both, because I say all of this about Reform history. And by the way, I say the Reform because, of course, we especially rabbis and ideologues, we spend a lot of time thinking about these issues, but it applies to liberals in general. We want to embrace the larger society. We embrace the principles, the fundamental principles of modern society, universal principles. We would like to think that we can overcome unreason, and that's why we feel the tension between Jewish peoplehood and universal principles the most. It's good to be in that place. I'm comfortable as a liberal. I'm comfortable being there because I know that tension is inherent in Judaism, and it's good for us to be receptive to the claims of the broader world. But what happens is Judaism at the end of the day is about the balance between universalism and particularism. And we have to maintain that balance at all times. There are elements in the Orthodox Jewish world who don't maintain that balance on the other end. And there are elements in our world, in the liberal world, that lose the balance on the universal side of it. And what we need to try and do, and what I try and do in our movement, is to maintain the balance at all times.
Well, let's talk about that. And so bringing it from the late 19th century to the early 21st century. It strikes me that when it comes to the question of Zionism, the challenge for you as a proudly Zionist Reform rabbi has become increasingly acute. I think that's probably fair to say. And I'd like you to talk us through or describe some of the challenges that you faced, maybe in the last few years, and how you're trying to address them. I'm talking about the political challenge when it comes to conversations about Israel.
Well,
and the theological challenge.
I think we are losing that balance. We are moving away from our commitments to Jewish peoplehood. The rabbis emphasize emphatically all Jews are responsible one for the other. And I think that the politics, of course, doesn't help, but I don't think the politics is the main reason. Israel's been governed by center-right parties and politics, and it is a center-right, politically, it's a center-right country. But I don't think that's the main issue that's tearing the communities apart. I think it's a increasing liberal challenge to the very essence of the Zionist ideas. I consider Zionism first and foremost to be a liberal philosophy. It's about collective self-determination of the Jewish people, this people that had been persecuted like no other people throughout history. And so I think increasingly the intellectual challenges are coming from the liberal side of the American political and ideological spectrum. I also think there's one additional factor that is hugely important, which is, and it goes to the central challenge of American Jewish life, I think, and that is, I think Jews are less Jewish. I think they're increasingly distanced from Judaism and from the American Jewish community. And because of that, they are increasingly distanced from the Jewish state, from Israel. I think and there's some empirical data to support this, by the way. And I see this on a general basis. The more you identify with Judaism, the more your self-identity is strong, the stronger tends to be your identification with Israel.
So, but I want to get to that in a moment, but I also want to talk about this open letter that was signed by last year by 93 rabbinic and cantorial students, some percentage of them from the Hebrew Union College, because there's also, one notices a movement among more observant Jews to find fault with Israel and argue that, in fact, the existence of the state of Israel or the reality of the state of Israel is in unbearable tension with what they see to be fundamental Jewish values. So the tension is not simply people slipping away from Judaism and finding fault with Israel. There's at least somewhere there are people who are slipping more into Judaism. I don't want to say slipping, but becoming at least more Jewishly knowledgeable, observant, and serious, who are anti-Zionists. And it seems like this poses not just a challenge for your generation of rabbis, but also perhaps a fundamental challenge to the reform movement in general if it ends up being populated by rabbis who take a radical position on Zionism and the state of Israel. So how do you see this? Was that letter much ado about nothing, or is it a serious challenge that has to be in some ways addressed, confronted?
Well, I think it is a potentially serious challenge, which is why I spend a lot of time fighting back, pushing back against this phenomenon. I might add, just parenthetically, I didn't comment on that letter, which was released in the height of the May hostilities, the May war with Hamas. I didn't comment on that letter until it appeared in your paper, Bret. And there was this huge, huge profile that seemed to me to impose on people like me an obligation to respond. The reason I didn't respond.
Do you think the letter got too much attention from the Times? Was it a tempest in a teapot?
I think it represents a real phenomenon. I think it's fundamentally a Jewish story. I think it was way too many assumptions on the part of the New York Times to suggest that this was, symptomatic or symbolic of where the American Jewish community is. It does portend a certain trend of where the younger part of the American Jewish community might be, and it does obviously reflect where the rabbinical students. It wasn't only rabbinical students, where seminary students are, and about a third of them were our seminary students, the Hebrew Union College. But the reason I didn't comment at the beginning, first of all, it was the middle of a war, and it seems to me that the Jewish community had much more on its mind in the middle of a war, with hundreds of thousands of Israelis rushing to bomb shelters every day, than to grapple in some kind of serious way with what 90 some odd seminary students thought about the war. And furthermore, I was a student once too. I was a rabbinical student. I thought a lot of things as a student that I either no longer think, or my views have mellowed. I respect the institution. I think we should leave as much room as possible for students to be students and to argue these things out. And so for that reason, for those two reasons, I actually didn't comment on this letter publicly until your paper released a huge profile. And one of the pictures in the magazine was from our sanctuary at the Hebrew Union College campus here in New York. So at that point, I felt it was very, very important to push back. And my main contention here is there are no doubt people who signed that letter who, if they were pushed to the wall, they would say, you know what, I do this for Zionist reasons. I believe in the state of Israel. I'm a harsh critic of its policies, but I'm not an anti-Zionist. I don't want to dismantle the Jewish state. But, Judaism is not only intellect, it's also of the heart. And what was astonishing about this letter was that in the middle of a war, there was no heart. First of all, there was no calling out of the people responsible for the war, which was Hamas, a fundamentalist, terrorist, anti-democratic, anti-feminist, anti-gay regime that no liberal would even spend a week in Gaza trying to convince Hamas or its supporters that they should implement liberal principles. But so there was no mention of Hamas. But beyond that, even more disconcerting for me was that there seemed to be no room in their hearts for our own people who are suffering in the middle of a war. And so from that to me is revelatory. That to me is the biggest challenge. It means that we have lost that part in part of the liberal American Jewish community. We have lost that part of the Jewish personality that requires us to love fellow Jews. The rabbis say when one Jew feels pain, all Jews feel pain. And there was no sense of pain in that letter for Jews.
So what does this, in reading that and just sort of thinking about these trends from your perch, writing an article in SAPIR, speaking out in the pages of the Times, and then in a long profile, really an excellent profile in Tablet magazine from our other contributor, Armin Rosen. What is the work that is required from the pulpit at the colleges, seminaries, in public discussions to start to explain to a younger generation of Jews what is required, as you put it? What is at least the functional minimum of Jewish obligation? And beyond that, what sort of understanding of Judaism does this ask of us?
So first of all, I think you pointed to a key point that's important, which is we do need to focus on the younger generations. It's not an entirely younger generation phenomenon, but it is more prevalent in the younger generations, and surveys bring that out. All in all, recent surveys have indicated that most Americans are sympathetic to Israel, most American Jews are sympathetic to Israel, and most liberal American Jews are sympathetic to Israel. The tension becomes becomes harsher the younger you go. So it is an important thing to focus on the younger generations, and it also is a sign of what may develop in the future if we don't attend to it. As I say, first of all, I think a big part of it is Jewish education in general. I think the most non-Orthodox American Jews are largely Jewishly illiterate, and therefore, when raised rightly so within a liberal atmosphere, are emphasizing to them how important it is to care about other people, to express universal values. If there's no grounding in Jewish tradition and there is no development of a strong Jewish self-identity and the emotional attachment that comes as a result of that, when they confront what they understand to be fellow liberals, whether in high school or in university, and there's no anchoring, and there's widespread Jewish illiteracy, then one can understand why they would resonate to arguments that are harshly anti-Zionist under the garb of liberalism. By the way, some of these attacks on Israel that supposedly are grounded in liberal values are fundamentally illiberal. They're not actually liberal. So that's number one, and that is not an issue that can be attended to by a seminar here or there or a great lecturer here or there. Obviously we need to be active and we need to take the Jews where they are. And so we need to continue to work on younger Jews in high school and in college. We ourselves are launching a massive program to do that. But one should temper their expectations. This is a very long-term process of Jewish education. Education is expensive and complicated and long-term. So we need to start from the beginning. The entire American Jewish community should be committed to supporting those institutions that are primarily responsible to develop Jewish identity in our youngsters and sustain Jewish identity over a lifetime. By the way, I would just mention, Bret, the three main institutions in the liberal side of the community for that, which is where most of the American Jews are, is day schools, summer camps, and synagogues. And of the three, synagogues by far are the most important because more Jews affiliate with synagogues than will affiliate with Jewish day schools or with summer camps. And two, synagogues are lifelong from cradle to grave. And so this is the main institution where we create Judaism and sustain Judaism in American Jews and of course in younger Jews.
One more point I would add to it, and I'd like your reflection. It's not just Jewish illiteracy, there's Israel illiteracy. I mean, you talk to younger Jews and you sort of have to, at least in my case, sometimes tear your hair out. How is it possible that we need to explain 1967, 1948? and explain it in a way that doesn't acquit Israel of every mistake. That, I think, is a mistake unto itself, to have a kind of hagiographic perspective on the history of the state of Israel. But other than birthright, which I think is often insufficient just because of the limitations of time, what, especially on the reform side, can be done to equip younger liberal Americans with the kind of Israel literacy they need to both defend the state, as a great enterprise of a people's liberation, and at the same time, have diverse and critical views about aspects of Israeli policy.
Yeah, so we need as many. First of all, only 40% of the American Jewish community on any given day affiliates with a synagogue, for example. So today, the majority of American Jews are not within anybody's reach. So they're beyond our influence, at least in terms of, the capacities of the institutions we represent to educate them. But the education in turn is twofold. Number one, and it's a combination of long-term and shorter-term goals. The longer-term goals I spoke about. Those longer-term goals need to include, when it comes to Israel, they need to include experiential educational opportunities. We take people to Israel as often as the market bears. There's no substitute for being in Israel in terms of learning about Israel, because again, I've always believed that we are who we are first, and then we rationalize it. And so we are emotional creatures. When it comes to where are our loyalties, it starts, it seems to me, from a basic emotional grounding on who we are and who we belong to. And so it has to include, there's just nothing like, you can't understand Israel from a classroom in New York anywhere near the manner in which you come to appreciate Israel with an Israel experience, even if the experience is 8 days. And I agree with you on Birthright. It is a phenomenal program. It has changed the lives of thousands, tens of thousands of people. It has probably strengthened American Jewry long term, but it does suffer from the limitation, and it's a severe limitation, that it doesn't really deal with kids before they go on the birthright trip. It doesn't really deal with the kids after they come back on the birthright trip. And all of this effort is invested in the 8 or 10-day trip in Israel. Still, far better than not having it at all. Incomparably better. But we pay a huge price in the American Jewish community if we focus only on the immediate need and not on the long-term educational effort that is required in order for us to overcome this challenge to the best of our capacities, optimally. And then there is room for the short-term immediate answers to the questions and the critiques leveled against us. And so part of the program that we've launched, for example, is to, as often as we can, reaching as many people as we can, whether they're members of the synagogue or not. We want to do seminars. We want to do workshops. We want to go into high schools. I, by the way, have been in high schools and spoken to students. We want to go into universities. We want to. We do want to support those programs. Those programs are enormously important, not only to bring knowledge and information and maybe change the minds of some people, but also in order to give confidence, give support, fortify those who are still persuadable, who know that something rotten is happening here, and to give them strength and to move them out of their shell. That is supremely important. That's, by the way, one of the key objectives that I have in our own movement with respect to our rabbis. The majority of rabbis in our movement, contrary to what might appear to be the reputation of the reform movement in some eyes. The majority of rabbis agree with me. So then the question is,
Is that true, by the way? I want to ask, is that true with younger rabbinical colleagues? Or as true?
It's less true. I think I don't know. I haven't seen surveys on this. By the way, it's something that I urged our seminary to do, to actually look at the 5-year rabbinical experience and to see how views might have changed and how we've come closer or not in accomplishing our objective to bring rabbinical students closer to Israel, because the movement is a Zionist movement. We're committed to Zionist principles. So we should have as an objective ordaining Zionist rabbis. And
so let me ask you about that. What is the proper attitude toward rabbinical students who are openly anti-Zionist? Do you expel them, not hire them? How should a movement deal with some percentage of people who are qualified and educated and simply profoundly out of sync, politically speaking, with the Zionist underpinnings of the movement?
First of all, we're a Zionist movement. We have committed ourselves to these principles over and over again. We have the headquarters of our world reform movement are in Jerusalem. The Hebrew Union College Seminary has a campus in Jerusalem. It was set up purposely to achieve ideological objectives. Let there be no confusion. Nobody should be surprised. We are a Zionist movement. It is our objective to ordain Zionist rabbis. It doesn't mean that we need to be in lockstep on every given political stance or every given policy of the Israeli government. Of course not. It's to our benefit that we argue about those things, but that's the nature of the reform movement. So first and foremost, it's important, in particular when a story that might be a local campus story all of a sudden gets into a multi-thousand word profile in the paper of record, the world paper of record. It is important to push back. It's important for two reasons. One, to let those who advocate these views know that they are in the small minority and they will receive criticism from the majority of us if they articulate these principles. Number two, it's important to give a backbone to the rest of the movement that these are our principles. Now, when it comes specifically to the students, look, I'm not part of the administration of the seminary, and I like very much. I like the people who are heading our movement, and it's not a personal thing, but I would just simply say this, and I don't know what the internal processes are in terms of interviewing people. The only thing I remember is my own interview, which was 35 years ago. It was pretty tough. I remember it was quite tough, and it included psychological evaluation as well. So I would just simply say this. We are entitled as a movement to say to young people who want to study for the rabbinate. It's not only the rabbinate, it's the cantorate, it's Jewish educators as well. We are entitled to say to them, here are our convictions, here are our principles. If you agree with these principles and if you meet our standards, we would love to accept you into our program. If you do not agree with these principles, bless you, go and do your thing, go study rabbinics in another seminary, not ours. We are entitled to do that as an institution because these are our stated values that have been reiterated over and over again for the last 70 years in our movement.
So I want to ask, I'm going to turn to audience questions in just a few minutes, but I want to ask about anti-Semitism, which is something that Orthodox Jews are encountering with terrifying frequency in neighborhoods in Brooklyn, murderous events in Pittsburgh, Muncie, in New Jersey, but also an anti-Semitism that is now coloring and pervading elite college institutions, or elite institutions, college campuses. And what I wonder about is whether, well, first of all, community response, but secondly, whether you think that this anti-Semitism will perversely and paradoxically perform something like the same function that it did in the late 19th and early 20th century to at least some segment of European Jewry in alerting them to the fact that the Enlightenment, liberalism, doesn't in fact solve all prejudices. In fact, it often creates prejudices. And there needs to be a response beyond denunciation or silence, but a political response that explains Zionism to begin with, right? And I guess my question is, do you see a new wave of anti-Semitism changing the discussion about Zionism in the United States?
I think
especially on the left.
I think it will have the effect of crystallizing the mind, concentrating the mind. And I think that what is likely to happen is what has happened in the past with respect to anti-Semitism, as you rightly point out, catalyzed the Zionist movement. It will have the effect at least to strengthen and fortify the commitments of the persuadables. I don't think we should be wasting too much time in the American Jewish community for those who have, who are not persuadable anymore. But the overwhelming majority of American Jews are persuadable. And I think that anti-Semitism, at least in a peripheral way, as it's expressed in its ferocious animosity towards Israel, I think it will have the effect of concentrating the mind of some people whose minds would not have been so concentrated. I just point out, by the way, that as I said before, I don't consider much of the left-wing savagery of Israel to come from people who are liberal. I don't believe that in terms of liberal principles. Liberals believe in reason, we believe in tolerance, we believe in evidence, we believe in persuading people. But it's also liberalism is kind of a state of mind. It's an emotion that approaches the problems of the world by accepting that all wisdom does not lie with me, and therefore I have an interest in creating communal, political, and intellectual pluralism as much as the system can withstand to allow for diversity and to reach better outcomes. So many of these attacks against Israel are left. They do come from the left, but I personally don't consider many of them liberal. And most American Jews are liberals.
So let me just ask you one final question about that before we go to our audience. It seems to me, and I'd just like your thoughts on this, that the problem with liberalism isn't that it's secretly illiberal. It's that it lacks the intellectual, or it frequently lacks the intellectual and moral resources to draw boundaries and, if necessary, shut down conversations which are threatening to the business of liberalism. I mean, which is to say that if you can admit that you're not in full possession of all truth, right, then you have to open yourself to every conceivable conversation, including and conceivable ideas, including conversations and ideas which aim to shut down liberalism itself. It's like admitting into democratic systems parties that mean to end the democratic system. And every now and then those parties succeed. That's what happened in Egypt in 2011 with the victory of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's what happened in Germany in 1933 with the victory of National Socialism. So is it possible, and does Judaism provide resources to maintain these qualities of an open mind with a sense of limits and openness to difference while maintaining an instinct for danger and an instinct for certain kinds of dangers which threaten the condition of liberalism itself, or the conditions that make liberalism possible?
Well, I would say, of course, your question is complicated and takes more time than what we have, but I would just point out the entire weight of Jewish tradition is to encourage pluralism, intellectual pluralism, and communal pluralism. There's no centralized authority on a communal basis. This idea of chief rabbis is a new idea. We didn't have them prior to the modern times. If you are even study Judaism, even from a cursory perspective, you will see there that truth unfolds, values are generated by a process, an astonishing, miraculous intellectual process of argumentation and debate. You open up any page of the Talmud, you will see there mostly debates, many of which, if not most of which, are unresolved. And there's something beautiful about that, because the rabbis of the Talmud didn't feel that they needed to resolve every issue. They were perfectly content to leave to future generations to argue it out themselves. Now, it doesn't mean that the community is not entitled to or even needs to agree on certain standards, that is, parameters. You can't have a society. You can't have the smallest human society, a family, a marriage. You can't have two human beings relating to each other, let alone a whole society, without limits. You do need limits, and the community needs to agree on what those limits are. But it seems to me that at the core of liberalism, at the core of Judaism, and from this perspective at least, Judaism is liberal. The Jewish tradition, the rabbis from antiquity, left as much space as they could for future generations to argue it out, because they understood that as times change, standards and values change as well.
So let me now turn to questions. And I'll start with Maya Farfel. She says, the author, Aleph Bet Yoshua, contends that the Jewish peoplehood and continuity is only possible in Israel. Given the high rate of intermarriage and the high cost of Jewish education and communal life, is Jewish life outside of Israel viable? Good question.
It's a fantastic question. Thank you for the question. And it's something, of course, that Jewish professionals obsess about, right? Now, so according to the numbers, let's say there's 6.5 million Jews who live in Israel. If you count how many Jews of the world there are by how many Jews identify as Jews, probably now already the majority of the world's Jews live in Israel. But for sure, that's likely to be the case in the next decade or two. More Jewish children are born in the majority of Jewish children live in Israel now. So, and no part of the diaspora community is growing, with the exception of a small part of very fervent Orthodox Jews, and their birth rate is nowhere near enough to supplant everybody else's. So it is true, and it should give us great concern about the future of diaspora Jewry, that we so far, at least in this era, are unable to produce enough Jews to replicate the Jewish community. We're losing Jews. We're hemorrhaging Jews in many parts of American Jewry. So I do think that the question is legitimate. It's appropriate. We're not at a lost cause for sure. You know, American Judaism is the most amazing Jewish community. There's never been a Jewish community in the diaspora like American Jewry. So accomplished, so affluent, so educated, so influential, so accepted. And so we have many things going for us. They're more, you know, they're more Jewish departments in universities. There's a greater openness to Judaism than ever before. But we need to find a way to invest many more resources and to be much smarter in sustaining American Jewry. Otherwise, there is a prospect that suggests that 50 years from now, the American Jewish community will be much smaller, much less influential, much less affluent, and much more conservative.
Brooke Schwartz, whose initials are mine, so I'm going to ask her question, asks Rav Hirsch, when you define liberalism, how much of those values, for example, willingness to hear out both sides and acknowledge you don't know everything and Arto was right, do you think are actually embodied by the majority of liberals? How many of your ideas about liberalism are based on what you believe it should be ideally versus what it actually is in practice?
I think most liberals would agree with the principles of liberalism as I described them in the last hour or so. Obviously, for all of us, and this goes to human nature more than political philosophy or intellectual philosophy, it is hard to hear critical views. It's not an easy thing. It's why we enshrine in law as well the obligation to create as much space as you can to hear views that are conflicting with you. But from a human perspective, it's a hard thing to do. So we sometimes don't live up to the standards that we expect.
But do you sense, as I do, now that I'm middle-aged, that there's been a kind of a closing of the liberal mind, that, for instance, the liberal convictions about free speech, which were almost universal 20 years ago, and represented in organizations like the ACLU, have become a minority view within the family of liberalism itself? Do you see a diminishment in liberalism, at least in practice? Just to follow up on Brooke's question, has that been your observation? Because it has been mine.
You know, I don't know. Maybe, Bret, you've seen some empirical data that shed some light on this. It's not been. I of course read what you read. I read about the ACLU, and I read the same articles you do. We've spent the last hour talking about some of the very troubling backsliding in liberal establishments, not only university, the media as well. Personally, I have not seen that in the many thousands of people that I interact with. Now, it could be that I interact with, it is for sure, I interact with self-selecting people who choose to interact with me and to be part of this institution and part of the institutional life. But at least with respect to those people who form the backbone of American Jewry, I haven't seen that.
Well, I hope you're right. I hope so. I'm not sure have a different experience. Let me look at another question here. A city question, since we're both in New York City. How do you respond to the CUNY City University of New York Law School faculty's anti-Israel response? Let me revise that. How should one respond to something like the City University of New York's anti-Israel stance?
Right. So that's when the faculty came out with, was it a disinvestment?
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
It was, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And anti-Israel speakers for graduation.
With all of our capacities, I don't think we are using enough of our capacities. First of all, on university, it is very important for the Jewish faculty to step up and to be supportive of the Jewish students who are under attack and to say the truth, to push back against their fellow faculty members. But with respect to the Jewish community, and we see this already in high schools as well, what I've been urging our congregants to do, and I think we need to do this across the board, is to use much more of the potential influence we have to stop these trends. And that includes contributing resources, money, if necessary. But I always urge our people, first, go to the administration. Don't assume that they're against you. Don't assume that they're not on your side. Educate them. Do your best to tell them what you believe and why you think they're wrong. If you are unable to do that, then we still have the obligation to push back, because otherwise we will slide further down. And everything we have at our disposal should be used to make the case, including the influence of alumni groups and including the influence of the support that the current community gives to the institution.
Robert Teicher asks, do you see any connection between weakening Jewish and Zionist connections among younger Jews and the prevalence of intermarriage among those younger Jews? And more to the point, and given that prevalence, is there a remedy?
Again, I think these phenomena, these trends are connected to what we talked about. First of all, if you embrace modern life and you don't shut yourself off from the world, then you are going to fall in love with people who are not Jewish, who have a lot in common with you. And that's just part of being part of the Western world in the 21st century. We still have an obligation to educate American Jews as much as we can, but intermarriage, for example, is a phenomenon that's here to stay, and to a certain degree, we need to accept that as part and parcel of living in the modern world. But also, not only with respect to the push and pull between universalism and particularism, also with respect to what I said before about the illiteracy in the American Jewish community generally, we have a general urgency to increase Jewish literacy across the board. And
one final question,
by the way, synagogues at the heart of it, because synagogues are the place where most Jews will congregate.
One final question, it'll probably run us a couple minutes over time, but I'm sorry I didn't get to it sooner. Victor Muslin asks, how does one maintain the balance between universalism and particularism when these notions are in conflict, in particular when Jewish safety and or status in society are under attack, as is the case in the US now? Does one set of notions take precedence over the other?
First of all, if an ideology is anti-Semitic, it by definition is not liberal, and it's dangerous. If an ideology asserts that Israel has no right to exist, as opposed to I am a very harsh critic of this or that Israeli policy, it is by definition illiberal and very dangerous. We need to push back on that as much as we can. And then what was just remind me, the
Well, the
actual,
question here is, in particular, when Jewish safety or status in society are under attack, as it is the case today in the US, does one set of notions, universalism or particularism, take precedence over the other?
look, the anti-Semitism is by definition attack against the Jews. By the way, it's part of a spectrum. It never limited to the Jews. It's always an expression of a state of mind that is filled with hate. But it's an attack on the particular reality of the Jewish people at all times. And we, not only in terms of what we know is right and wrong and what is what is not only right for us, but what's right for American society, but also a fundamental lesson of Jewish history. Wherever we see anti-Semitism, we need to push back and stop it and call it out as aggressively and as quickly as we can, because it metastasizes. And let nobody be confused. Not all, but much of the attacks on Israel, in particular, the attacks that suggest that Israel has no right to exist at all, which is the BDS argument, are fundamentally and by their nature anti-Semitic for two reasons. One, there's 6.5 million Jews who live in Israel. Where would they go? And what would we do with them? And what do you propose if dismantling Israel, what would happen to them? And secondly, it's what other country in the world is challenged on its basic right to exist? We don't even challenge Afghanistan's basic right to exist. So this is a continuation of a very long, centuries-old history of animosity towards Jews dressed up in modern garb.
Rabbi Hirsch, thank you for a wonderful hour of really a far-ranging discussion. Wonderful as it was, your essay is even better. So for those of people listening in who haven't read it yet, it's in this current issue of SAPIR, which we will be happy to send you if you give us your address, along with subsequent issues. Our next issue is going to be on the subject of education. This is the subtitle of SAPIR is a journal of Jewish conversations. We exist for conversations like this. So thank you so much for participating.
Thank you for having me and for asking me to participate, and keep up the good work, Bret.
Thanks.